And hello, everyone. So nice to see so many people there in Vancouver. Sounds like you've got a fabulous series of workshops upcoming. That just sounds great. I wish I was there to come. Anyway, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you tonight. What I'm going to do is I've created a bit of a PowerPoint and I'm going to, it's just photos, so it's not dry facts. So I'm going to read a couple of little sections out of the book. The book came out in June of this year. I've been working on it for over 3 years. And it's been a lot of fun. I've met a lot of fabulous people. Of course, I interviewed over 75 people, many of them in person and some of them by phone, and just found out how fabulous everybody's work has been. Primarily volunteer, they're primarily board members that I interviewed. And then in the end, I ended up interviewing some of the current staff of some of these island land trusts. So land trust is a conservation organization that can hold land. Either they acquire it themselves or they register on title, a covenant, or some kind of a way of having a control over the land. And so it's been something that's been going on for many, many years, kind of started in the US and then it moved to Canada, where a lot of Canadians took on this great tool to protect land. Didn't have to go through, laws or governments. It's just something that people could do themselves. So I'm going to share my screen. So this is obviously an image of the cover, and just put what someone has said about it there underneath, because it does chronicle the history of local conservation organizations on 17 islands from the 1990s to the present day. So Carolyn sort of introduced a bit about me there, and I'm a bit of a mapping geek. I just love maps, and I've been working on many mapping books, it seems, over the years. Starting with a national and magazines, maps and magazines seems to be my thing. I started with a national magazine in the late 80s, very kind of hippie-ish title, Positive Vibrations, which was around for about 3 years. And then I moved to Salt Spring Island after that and set up the Recycle Depot, an International Green Building Conference, and a book that went with that called Building Green on the Rural Gulf Islands. And then I started doing some workshops actually with Bryony, Carolyn's sister, Bryony Penn, teaching people how to map their own land and how to put down on paper what they saw on their land. And so we did that on several islands. And this book, Giving the Land a Voice, Mapping Our Home Places, is kind of a how-to. And then, worked with a lot of wonderful people to start the LandTrust Alliance of BC, which is a province-wide alliance of land trusts. And then worked on another project, which I might get back to later on in the end, because we're putting it into a website right now, and it's very exciting. A series of community maps done by artists that portrayed what they valued in the turn of the millennium. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to read three different islands, just little bits out of 3 different island sections to give you a taste of what the book is like, starting with Bowen Island. I completed the last leg of my conservation sailing journey in July 2023. Sailing downwind through a lumpy northwester, it took 6 long hours to reach my destination, Bowen Island, on the outer reaches of Howe Sound. Squamish Nation elders unveiled a new sign at Snug Cove, welcoming visitors to Next Lexwim, Bowen Island, in 2021. It was a fitting gesture, given that the island is an integral part of Squamish territory. I just want to stop for a minute and say, if anybody has any questions, put them in the chat, and at the end of each section, I'll have a look there and we can have a little conversation. So back to Bowen Island. Surprisingly, Bowen Island in the coastal western hemlock zone has a higher level of mature and older forest than the islands in the coastal Douglas fir zone. Given its proximity to Vancouver's 3 million people, one would think the island would be more suburban. The saving grace is the Crown lands found on three high peaks, Mount Gardner and Mount Collins, plus the large 395-hectare ecological reserve on Apodaca Peak in the southeast side. These Crown lands comprise 40% of the island's land base. Due to these high mountain peaks and the logging, which happened earlier than on the more remote Gulf Islands, 58% of the forests are between 80 and 250 years of age. I nestled in the shade of these forests on my hot summer visit and stood in awe at the base of one of the biggest trees I'd found on the island. Unlike the drier coastal Douglas fir, Bowen and Gambier have far more rain than the islands they face across the Salish Sea. When I arrived at Snug Cove and its neighboring Qualicum or Deep Mannion Bay, I was struck by the extent of development, with numerous close-knit houses and many private docks. At Snug Cove, hourly ferries arrive full of day trippers, residents, summer residents, and contractors. Just up from the terminal is a hub of commercial stores and restaurants that I hadn't seen on any other island beyond Salt Spring. A bald eagle called my attention to the forested south shore of Snug Cove. Low-flying herons and seals draped on the rising rocks of Qualicum's southwest shore, revealing a continuous embankment that leads to a public causeway installed a century ago, behind which is a lagoon and the island's terminal creek. After the Second World War and the arrival of the Blackball ferries, later acquired by BC Ferries, the Union Steamship Company started to sell some of their cottages, including one along the waterfront, sold to the grandparents of a pioneer conservationist, John Rich. For more than 50 years, John Rich's family has lived in the same house near Snug Cove. He's seen a lot of change. Early in our conversations, he remarked, if it wasn't for the threats to the natural environment and the enjoyment of it as a natural place, I'd probably be a retired carpenter. Instead, John lived a far from quiet life, as he went on to be the chair of the island's trust for 6 years, and after that, he became a lawyer and worked with several First Nations on litigation of historical claims and Aboriginal rights. Today, John is on the board of the Bowen Island Conservancy. John moved with his wife to live full-time on Bowen in 1973. He said, Kim and I were just putting roots under us when we found that a developer wanted to put thousands of houses on the neighboring property and urbanize the place. Stan James, a developer with a deplorable track record, purchased 1,500 acres of the former steamship lands, stretching from north of the largest lake on the island, Killarney Lake, down to the former resort lands near Snug Cove. James bought the land by securing private mortgages at 25% interest rates, counting on a quick sale of some 3,000 housing units, golf courses, etc. That would generate the funds for payments, along with a very substantial profit. A pro-development director of the Greater Vancouver Regional District implemented a zoning bylaw that would allow 10,000 quarter-acre lots and a lodge on Bowen Island. Shortly after, in 1969, the provincial government's 10-acre freeze on the islands resulted in the GVRD and the province putting a hold on the bylaw. John had much to say about the antics that the developer, Stan James, used as the people holding the mortgages started to get worried. John explained, James owned the community's water system as well as part of what he purchased, and he was threatening to cut off the water. He also threatened to cut off access to his property, which had been used for recreation forever by Bowen residents. The first thing he did actively was close the causeway that goes between the lagoon and Deep Bay. In order to get from Deep Bay to Snug Cove, you have to walk on the causeway. Lots of people lived on the other side, and the community had been using it for over 50 to 60 years. So he built a chain link fence. People hauled it down. That's when I became active in 1975 in Bowen affairs, John told me. We were particularly affected by the causeway closure, and I had a problem with his attitude and proposal. We formed a committee for causeway access to fight back. This got me more involved in the local political scene. Then I got involved in the local advisory planning committee. Using that springboard and level of interest, I ran in 1976 for the newly minted Islands Trust, with another new trustee supportive of putting an official community plan in place, which would include recreational and conservation values. With the developer under duress from the mortgage holders and the new official community plan that called for rural rather than urban development, James decided to start logging. From Snug Cove over to Killarney Lake, the largest lake on Bowen. The community had always seen this area as environmentally and recreationally significant. With virtually no control over actions on private land, John convinced the 3 general trustees appointed by the province to request a stop work order to stop the logging under the BC Environment and Land Use Act. The act was a lucky route for Bowen, as John said it was only used 3 times across the province, then rescinded. John described the intense days during the community's protest against James. In the winter of 1977, James was trying to get a logging operation in. He got a cat too large to go on the ferry, so it was delivered to Sandy Beach or Deep Bay. A smaller logging show came on the ferry with a skidder and a small cat and about 4 guys. They went to a place where the contractor had things stored. Everyone knew logging was imminent, the beginning of the next week. So we had 3 to 4 days. Along with others in the community, we decided to have a demonstration and try to interfere with the logging and hope that the province would agree with our resolution for the stop work order. Stanley Burke, a member of a Vancouver family who, with a couple of other families, owned a 600-acre piece of land on the southwest corner, was sympathetic to the struggle. He owned various small newspapers and had worked for the CBC. He asked John, "What do you plan to do?" "Show up and stand in front of the bulldozers," we said. John described the resulting dramatic event. Burke said, "But you got to make it presentable for TV. Use fire extinguishers and stop the engine." He sent us a bunch of fire extinguishers. He sent us a bunch of media too, and at 7 a.m., 50 people were standing out where the logging was going to start. Up the street came the Sun, the province, 3 TV and 1 radio station. They were pissed off to come for householders and hippies, but we were delighted. The loggers showed up and the bulldozer driver, and we stood in the way of things. This small outfit started their machines and drove forward, but the driver told his guys to stand down, get out of the way, but the bulldozer driver was storming. Stan James' manager showed up. He was a great big guy, very hostile. He showed up drunk with coffee and something you could smell in it. We tried to make a deal with him to stop until we met to negotiate plans for the land. He agreed to that, and we wrote it out and both signed. We were pretty naive. Then he realized what he'd done, and he tried to snatch it back. The TV gets the action. The agreement was to stand down, but the bulldozer driver doesn't agree. He doesn't have the keys, though, as someone has taken them. Assuming things had settled, someone throws the keys back to him because of the agreement. But he starts his bulldozer and drives into the crowd with people on his blade, a potter and a 13-year-old gal. He drives, trying to shake them off. The whole crowd is running along beside. TV cameras are getting it. He stops at the precipice. The potter's wife climbed over the track, grabbed the driver, who punched her, following which the potter climbed over the machine from the blade and slugged the driver. This is all on national television news that night. And just as this was happening, a radio operator came in and said, "The stop work order just came in." John explained how the land eventually became a regional park. A group of islanders created a society, the Park and Store Use Society, with its goal to establish a park and save a heritage building, which is now the library. John felt this was a long shot because the province wasn't making parks in those days, and the GVRD had just adopted a park plan with no more room in it. But that didn't discourage people on the island. We lobbied and negotiated to do whatever we could. Eventually, we managed to work with the GVRD to make a deal with the province to purchase 700 acres out of James Holdings. At that point, his mortgages were held by Crippen Engineering, who got burned badly. They had a stop work order and an angry community. The GVRD chairman, Jim Ton, sealed the deal with Crippen when he suggested, "How about $2 million and we'll call it Crippen Park?" Today, Crippen Regional Park is 240 hectares, including Killarney Lake, all along Terminal Creek, leading down to the lagoon behind Qualicum, Deep or Mannion Bay. The park also includes extensive trails leading from north of the lake down to the lagoon to the older causeway. Contains the Terminal Creek Hatchery, Fish Ladder, and Bridalveil Falls, out to Snug Cove and beyond to its end at Dorman Point. The acquisition of Crippen Park is a perfect example of how local people with patience and persistence can conserve the land in their own communities. Okay, so let's just see if I've got anybody asking questions in the chat. Nope, I don't see anything. Does anyone have any questions about that, about Bowen? Of course, today, I'll just mention the Bowen Island Conservancy is a rearing organization, and they, as you may know, are trying to make a deal with Metro Vancouver now to buy some of the lands that Metro Vancouver has purchased. The Cape Roger Curtis area, which the Bowen Island Conservancy and many Bowen Islanders have been trying to protect for many decades, actually. So anyway, they are working to purchase some of those lands from the regional district because the regional district wants to make it into a campground, and a lot of Bowen Islanders are not in favor of that. Okay, still no questions. So I'm going to read a different section about a different situation. It's not a protest at all. It's about people on Pender Island getting together to raise funds. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing. Okay, the Bowen Island Conservancy acquired, I can't remember offhand now how many acres of it, which they've called the Wild Coast Nature Refuge. And in the book, of course, I talk about nearby island conservancies as well, including Gambier Island Conservancy and the newest LandTrust in the Atkinson Howe Sound UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, the Keats Island Conservancy. Now, are your pictures in the way of seeing my screen over here on the right? Because
no,
are you seeing it all fine?
We can see your screen just fine.
Perfect. Okay. I'll just mention on Gambier, one of the things, they found a coastal tailed frog, which is quite rare. And because it is so rare, it helped defer some logging at Whispering Creek, which is some crown lands on Gambier. Gambier has a lot of crown lands. And the Conservancy there has been working tirelessly, primarily using advocacy because it's crown lands and they can't purchase them, to try and protect some of the forest there. And then over here on the right is the image of Glenn Dennison, who has been finding and mapping glass sponge reefs all over the Sound. An amazing man doing all this. And one area has been protected off Gambier Island because of his work finding these glass sponge reefs. And I'm just taking a break for a second if anyone has a question before I move into reading the next section.
I don't see anything in the chat.
All right. So, and by the way, when I interview these people, I guess it's clear, I did sail there to all the islands. And so this photo on the left is Hayashi Cove, which is where I anchored on Pender Island, which is right in the middle of the Gulf Island National Park Reserve. And you'll see the little purple martin boxes there with the heron on top. And then on the right is one of the founders of the Pender Island Conservancy, Sylvia Pincock. Okay, so Medicine Beach. The story of Pender Island's successful conservation of threatened places starts with Medicine Beach. It was the first protected place on the Gulf Islands conserved by local islanders and a newly formed conservation land trust. The sheer number of people involved, their creative ideas, their determination, and their ability to bring in a multitude of sources to help them raise $500,000 to protect a property which to them had immense ecological significance in little more than 6 months is incredible. The cost and effort seemed beyond the reach of such a small community in 1993, but these people had perseverance and optimism. The 20-acre Medicine Beach property is at the head of Bedwell Harbor, which lies between North and South Pender Island. Medicine Beach is known by the Wasanish First Nation as Iho, with an extensive archaeological midden that stretches along the shoreline. It has a long history of use as the historical location of a summer village site of the Wasanish people. For the people of the Pender Islands at the time, it had its own strong medicine. Dr. Don Williams led the fundraising committee of 10 who worked tirelessly for 6 months to secure the property owned at the time by the Atkins family. Everyone I talked with about this project stressed that the wetland and beach were key to its attraction. Don described it as a marsh jewel. He and Carl Hampson, another member of the committee and one of the early directors of PICA, explained why the community would want to protect it. According to Dr. Don, as he's affectionately known on the Penders, the impetus was that we were a wild place with at least one drinking establishment. There was a pub on South Pender, long before Poets Cove and Browning Harbor. It was a pretty wild place on the weekends. I used to be the doctor, so I spent a lot of Saturday nights sewing people up. Amongst the conversations Carl and I had was, we don't need another pub. That was a bit of a conversation between them, those who wanted to buy the Atkins property and set up a marina, and us. Shelley Easthope, from the family who built the famous Easthope marine engines, was in the us camp. She spent her life near the ocean with a close connection to the land her family owned above Medicine Beach. We had a lot of respect for the land, the fish, and especially the marshland. We were steeped in how important it was. A lot of people don't see that, and when you live close to it, you know it. Shelley recalled a day that the new fundraising committee met with the Atkins over lunch. The matriarch of the family said they'd been approached multiple times while they held the land by someone wanting to purchase it to turn it into a marina, because that's what happens on this type of land on these islands. Shelley explained that the family knew how precious it was because development, especially of sites on the waterfront, was happening everywhere. The fundraising committee was key to the project's success. Dr. Don Williams described them as real optimists, each with a job based on their skills and interests. Those whose profession was writing, editorials, and university people were the writing division. Some brought muffins to the meeting. 2 or 3 would go give a talk at one of the clubs to answer questions. They brought in a professional fundraiser who advised them to make the campaign short. They decided on 6 months. They brainstormed about how to get the community to come up with the needed funds. Dr. Don explained their communication plan and next steps. We talked big about the total package of $500,000. That helped, as everyone thought that was daunting. It became clear we needed a biological survey. Jan Kirkby, a biologist who lives on Pender, did an initial assessment of the marsh, including identifying the different ecosystems and species she found in this rare place where freshwater and saltwater meet, with a cattail marsh at the back. Don Williams reiterated the values of the marsh. The biologists were starting to see that these wet marshes were not just valuable for the ecology, but also in recycling hazardous things. Natural filters of metals and other nasty things we're putting into the environment. That got people's attention in the early press releases. Lawrence Pitt, the link between the fundraising committee and PICA, wrote many of the formal grant applications. He said that the community had raised funds for decades for things, but this was the first eye-popping amount. He described how they brought in local donations. As it began to go forward, it had a magic of its own. We were in the right place at the right time. It was so gratifying to pull that off. The whole community got really active. Dr. Don devised this idea, a list of deep pockets on the island, and we would go and visit them. Our initial idea was they would bone up. Well, that sort of worked, but the community was doing it at smaller scales. But one big donor, Ursula Popel, a local pharmacist, stepped up with 10,000 each, so that really catalyzed a lot of energy. Another donor I recall was May Moore, the singer-songwriter. Her father donated his boat, one he had built and loved. But at the time, he was in the last stages of cancer and had very little energy. When we went to say hi to thank him for it, his eyes just lit up. Dr. Don and myself and the father were outside talking boats. May Moore and her mother were saying, "Come in out of the rain." And he said, "In a bit, we're talking boats." Don was a boater too. It really helped to galvanize the community. This was happening at the same time as the purchase of Jedediah Island. They learned that a landowner could get a tax receipt for reducing the price, equivalent to donating it for conservation. Lawrence told me during our telephone interview that the family made the biggest donation of $127,000, making it feasible to raise the rest. Lawrence said, the first big chunk came from the Nature Conservancy of Canada and Wildlife Habitat Canada for 60,000. Once we knew we could publicize that, we could get the community active in thinking about how we could do it. Thanks to Lawrence and Don Williams and many visits to Victoria, they secured a grant of 78,000 from the BC Habitat Conservation Trust Fund. Time was of the essence for the family. Don Williams described some of the details of the events and individual meetings that resulted in hard-won donations toward the purchase. We worked hard all winter. We wrote to all the foundations. We got every community club on the island to put on one event, and each of the board members put on one event. Groups such as the Girl Guides put on a fantastic dinner evening. The committee members turned out in tuxedos for the fancy dinner. All these little events turned into a huge amount of public interest and support. The Lions Club, all the clubs donated. These events really caught the attention of people with deep pockets, and we would go see them personally. There was a guy who involved in building downtown Vancouver, George Coates, who owned a coal mine in Alberta. He said, "You're going to fail, but okay, I'll take you on. I'll make a donation. Come back in May after winter, and we'll see how you've done. I'll then donate a sizable chunk." One old timer said, "What the hell do you want that swamp for?" I thought these were just things we could build on. Curmudgeons, answer their questions, sharpen our approach. We did, and Coates paid up. An entire community got behind the protection of a relatively small 20 acres of land. Because this was the first conservation acquisition initiated by locals as early as 1993, it was a coming of age for the Land Trust community. I recall the stunning map that Michelle Marsden did of Medicine Beach, which was published in Giving the Land a Voice, Mapping Our Home Places. Doug Stanley did watercolors and small paintings. Kevin Oakey did a beautiful poster, which is still being sold by the local conservancy in its new storefront office today. Lawrence Pitt described the culminating events, which ended with, of course, a big celebration. At the end, we had a big event at Clam Bay Farm. We had a stage and music and dancing, and the premier, Mike Harcourt, came and brought the check over from his minister. We said, "We're just short of the total amount that we need." The amount missing was $58. This was just the amount the local brownies had raised the weekend before. So the brownies put us over the top, and it was a done deal. It was the right time, a coming of age of this community, setting the stage for future stuff. Today, Medicine Beach is protected for its wildlife and ecological values and is still a beloved area for Pender Islanders. The marsh is partially fenced with beautiful illustrated educational signage outside near a parking area. The forested area has a trail and stairs. The beach is still accessible with the road coming down to the parking area. The Pender Island Conservancy and local islanders did the work of raising the funds, and then they passed the title to the Islands Trust Fund, now called Conservancy, who now own the property while Pika manages it and monitors it. Okay. But now the go down isn't working again. What is that about?
Actually, there is a question.
Oh, yay.
So rather than starting there, so it's, let me just read it to you. Where is Medicine Beach in relation to the channel between North and South Pender Island?
Yeah, it's right there. It's on North Pender Island and it's facing South Pender Island, and over to the left is the man-created canal with the bridge that goes between the two islands. See that?
Yep, it's all fine. Beautiful shot.
Yeah, that is an incredible shot by Miles Clark. And so this is from Brooks Point. So I just wanted to mention that that was just the first project on Pender Island. Pender Island went on and protected two incredible areas on South Pender Island. This is from Brooks Point, looking, of course, at Mount Baker. And then on the other end of that isthmus is Gowland Point. And so they protected the whole thing over several years and lots of work and fundraising. And it's now owned by the CRD as a regional park. And also I wanted to mention that Pender Island Conservancy, they now have a new storefront. That's the image on the left there. It was very cool to see it. It's in Hope Bay, which is kind of over on the east-facing side of Pender. And they bring in summer students, as do a lot of these land trusts. And these summer students on Pender had created this wonderful illustration of what happens with the purple martins that come to most of the islands in the summer and how they migrate all the way down to Brazil. And so they made these little maps and illustrations to show that to people on Pender. Okay, now I'm going to talk about Saturna. From a knoll on Saturna Island's east point, I reveled in the raucous sounds of golden-colored stellar and darker California sea lions. I watched fascinated as these giant marine mammals lugged themselves up onto boiling reef. The island's rich marine life is a result of the nutrient-rich, turbulent waters created by the tides, the swift currents, and the Fraser River. These waters attract marine mammals, southern resident orcas, transient orcas, humpback whales, minke whales, seals, porpoises, dolphins in staggering numbers. The bald eagles, cormorants, oyster catchers, river otters, and ravens were all within sight of each other, some claiming the same rock and the same fish. I felt right in the midst of the phenomenal Salish Sea. This spectacular scene was marred by the fog, or was it smoke? The big smoke, the city of Vancouver in the distance. Although Saturna Island feels remote, it is within a major transportation corridor surrounded by a population of 8 million people. Saturna Island, with its southern shores facing Boundary Pass, is the furthest south and east island on the Canadian side of the Salish Sea. As the Saturna Island Marine Research and Education Society, SIMRES, has aptly phrased, this is an ideal place to study the convergence of wildlife and humanity. The island is also known as Tektexan, a name in the Sanchothan language meaning long nose, which refers to this peninsula at its very eastern point. In many ways, Saturna is unique because it is in the geographic center of the entire Salish Sea, reaching from Reed Island in the north to Lummi Island and Bellingham in Washington state. Conservation efforts on the island focus both on the rich marine environment that surrounds the islands and its at-risk terrestrial environment. I met with 4 of Saturna's outstanding volunteer conservationists: Maureen Welton, a graphic artist; Martin Whale is a retired doctor by trade; Susie Washington Smith is a scientist who worked both with the Islands Trust and the Nature Conservancy of Canada. They're all working with SIMRES, the Saturna Island Marine Research and Education Society. I also met with Priscilla Eubank, another longtime conservationist on Saturna Island, who has an in-house Saturna Ecological High School program on her land, and she owns the general store. Priscilla arrived on the island in 1970. She explained during our interview in her wonderful hand-hewn home that she came young and fresh out of university with a landed immigrant card. I knew I was home when I stepped off the Main Queen and walked up the road past the Saturna Community Hall and into my new island life. Initially, she was attracted to the island's stunning physical beauty and enthralling biodiversity. Over time, however, she became just as drawn to the island's vibrant social and activist community. The Heritage Community Hall and the annual Saturna Lamb Barbecue have been mainstays in her life. This tiny community off the beaten track grew skilled in charting its own path. When faced with a school closure due to low enrollment in 2008, the community responded by establishing the Saturna Ecological Education Center. It serves grades 9 to 12 students. The goal was a residence-based, outdoor, ecologically focused education program. A local architect, Richard Blagborn, designed the building. His inclusion of an off-grid alternative energy system supported the school's ecological goals. Thanks to ecologically minded educators, the superintendent of the district, and a local teacher, it was opened in 2011 with an outdoor curriculum that was ahead of its time. Under Schools District 64's authority, the kids complete the mandated curriculum for the last 2 years of high school. The students live in sleeping cabins through the week. The school's common building offers a warm meeting space and classroom. It began the year in 2023 with a full registration of 12 students. The school project coincided with another innovative community initiative. In 2009, another collective environmental education and heritage project involved salvaging and restoring a lighthouse, the Fog Alarm Building, or FAB, at East Point, Texan. Assisted by federal agencies and scientific researchers, the community converted the old lighthouse into an information center, showcasing local marine biodiversity and island history. Run by the Heritage Committee of the Saturna Community Club, they acquired grants and student help. Then they started to design their first installation about the history of humans and orcas. This featured the evolving scientific understanding and relationships between whales and people. This led to one of the most seminal events on Saturna Island, the 2013 Whale Symposium. The conference brought together leading scientists and long-standing whale researchers from the 1950s to discuss the trends and potential impacts on the southern resident killer whales and other whales in the Strait of Georgia. Richard, who coordinated the project with another 80 volunteers, told me during our interview that the months he spent restoring the Fog Alarm Building at East Point made him realize it was an astounding sight. Being at the central apex of the Salish Sea, you saw lots of natural wonders, the orcas, eagles, owls, and sea lions, yet you could lift your eyes and see Cherry Point, the refinery, and ships going by. What it revealed to me was this is a fascinating place for science, being right on the boundary. Maureen and Martin recounted that in 2014, Richard Blagborn, one of our island residents, initiated a whale conference on Saturna. It was the 50th anniversary of Moby Doll, captured at East Point off of Saturna Island for the Vancouver Aquarium. This was the first orca captured on the West Coast. The aquarium wanted to build a whale sculpture, but they didn't know the dimensions. They commissioned an artist harpoonist to capture an orca so they could then make this sculpture. Maureen added, they had no success until the day they were leaving, when the J-pod came by. They harpooned a youngster, but it didn't die. They towed the young whale to Vancouver, and it swam along with its mother following. Then it was kept in an enclosure at Jericho Beach. Thousands came to see this killer whale that, up until that time, 50 years ago, was considered a Moby Dick sort of monster, a human-killing creature. Not long after, it died, possibly from a skin disease or from damage made by the harpoon and additional gunshots used to try to kill it. However, this captured whale changed how humans relate to whales. With the interactions between Moby Doll and his visitors, it was determined after naming that the whale was male, including the very man who captured him, people saw that the whale's behaviors showed a deep bonding between their kin. They learned what these orcas ate and that they were highly intelligent. Thus began the scientific study of the three subspecies we know today: transients, offshore, and residents. When all the whale researchers in the field came to Saturna for this 2014 conference, it became the impetus for people to realize their island is an unusual place. This is where it all started, Susie said. We realized there's something unique about this area and that we are in the middle of the Salish Sea. Bill Austin, who started the Shaw Marine Center in Sydney, identified that we have some of the richest biota in and around the Salish Sea. During our interview, Martin described some of the successful SIMRI's projects. In collaboration with Professor Ruth Joy of Simon Fraser University, 2 of her master's students have come annually to Saturna to undertake fieldwork on whales and vessels in and around the waters of East Point. Martin also mentioned other SIMRI's projects, including eelgrass studies, sea star counts, collaboration with Parks Canada regarding the marine environment, and broom eradication on parklands. SIMRI's installed hydrophones to provide a live underwater soundscape in Boundary Pass. Martin added that thanks to donations from individual donors, they now have hydrophones recording cetaceans 24/7 in Boundary Pass. You could be lucky enough to hear different cetaceans from the recordings made by these hydrophones located at the pass from SIMRI's website, live. Actually, the website is the one I put on the picture there. It's called spyhopper.ca, and I would highly suggest you check it out. It's fascinating to hear live what's going on. I don't know now with all the increases in ship traffic thanks to the new pipeline, whether or not you hear the ships going by as well, because they have to stay in Canadian waters, so they would be right near Boundary Pass and the point there. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now, see if there's any questions. Let's see. Sounds like the Land Conservancy does great work and has done for decades. Mentioning just names some of the places. Okay, there's a lot of questions there. So first of all, I'm not sure which land conservancy you're talking about, but does the Conservancy work with local First Nations at all? Yes, some conservancies are definitely working with local First Nations. I'll mention Pender and Galliano particularly. Galliano is working with the Penelakut, and they have a forage forest, they call it, and they do harvesting of deer and harvesting of plants within this forage forest with the community, and then talk about how to do those things, do workshops on it. And in addition, they have done some work with renaming places, telling stories about, what happened on Galliano prior to the colonists coming. And on Pender Island, the fellow who's done a lot of work at Brooks Point, Paul Petrie, he was telling me about the boats that were coming over, in addition with the Rain Coast Conservation Society, who also has a head office on Pender, bringing people from the Wasanish nations over and doing workshops and talks, and they're renaming places, kind of reclaiming some of those areas. Now, your last question here was, they considered giving the land back to them, or giving the land to them to maintain, and what sorts of barriers are there? Well, yes, the Land Conservancy of BC has recently done just that. They raised the funds to protect Halibut Island, which of course has another First Nation name. And now they're working with a group of First Nations on handing the land back to them with a management plan in place that makes the Land Conservancy feel comfortable about it. And that's just the first. Now there's actually a First Nations land trust on the Saanich Peninsula. So it's got its own land trust to start doing some of this work. So it really is taking off today in the world. Oh, I just mentioned Halibut Island. Okay. Okay. So I just wanted to mention some of the other islands that I focus on in the book. I've talked about Penders and Saturna. On Galliano, their story is saving it from the corporation, i.e. Macmillan Bloedel, who owned over 50% of the island, and they had a huge fight in those days. But eventually, over time, they picked off areas and ended up buying areas, and now they are a huge successful organization with over 8 staff on Galliano Island. They just had a big a gathering of other island land trusts on actually that windy Friday that we had last week. So anyway, they are a land trust to learn from, because they have done amazing things and are now kind of ahead of the pack. On Main Island, they've done a lot of conservation from US landowners. So they've learned how to work conservation across the borders. There's an organization called American Friends of Canadian Land Trusts. And that organization's whole purpose is to work with American landowners who have Canadian land, who are interested in conservation, and helping them do the deal across the border. Salt Spring, of course, big fundraising, big protests, and generous donations. I lived on Salt Spring for 22 years and was intimately involved in the Burgoyne Bay, Mount Maxwell, Texada Logging Company protests, and in the end, we purchased the land. And Gabriola, because they've got tiny little lots on Gabriola, they focus on trails. So, and these are all kind of the subtitles to the chapters. So in this one, In Trails We Trust. And so they are working to build trails through private property and having licenses that allow the public to go on those trails so that they can get to the water all over the islands. And then they do other work like, invasive species removal, which all these groups do, and work with people who are new purchasers who buy a house and they want to, of course, take the old one down, which is a bit of an action that's going on a lot in the world. And so what they do is they go in and they dig out the plants and then they offer them for sale to other landowners. So that's a great program. Thetis, Women Leading the Way. It was 3 women who started off the Thetis Island Conservancy called Think. And that they've protected 2 very large properties on the island and are doing incredible work. Denman, they, again, another island with all kinds of logging companies, and one logging company sold to another one. They have agreements about what they will and will not log, and then the next company just ignores it. And so they ended up winning in court. It was quite amazing because there's been a lot of losing in court over forest lands on the islands, and they won in court because they had made an agreement with one of the logging companies that they wouldn't log in an area. And so what they won was a whole area of land which had been logged. But they managed to do a lot of restoration on it, and Denman has purchased all kinds of properties themselves. Hornby, their focus is on hillsides and herring. They do a lot of work trying to protect herring because around their area between Denman and Hornby is the last significant commercial herring fishery. Amazing areas there because of the herring. And so they've been working to try and stall it or stop it. On Savory, they saved the big center island there. It was a huge campaign. On Quadra, again, they did a campaign to save the heart of Quadra. And on Cortez, they don't have a land trust there because it's quite a small island, although it's, quite a bit bigger than Lasqueti, and we have one. But anyway, what they have on Cortez is a lot of conservation covenants. And so individual islanders count. They can do conservation to themselves. And so we describe a couple on the island that I focus on and what they did with their covenant and how they did it. And then, of course, Lasqueti, where I'm from, in the middle of everywhere, we've got a lot of archaeology and Indigenous relations going on Lasqueti because Dana Lepofsky lives there, because I'm not there right now. And so there's been a lot going on where we've now learned that there are sites on the island that show habitation over 5,000 years old. And so there's been a lot of outreach to the Indigenous people around Lasqueti, and we've protected a lot of land on Lasqueti as well. And hopefully, yes, I can go to the next slide. So just give that's actually from Savory Island, that beautiful picture there. That was just a little quote from Sarah Cox about how she felt about reading the book. And then just telling you how you can find out where to get the book. In Vancouver, you just check out that link there, Indie Bookstores, which stands for Independent Bookstores. And you can find out what bookstores carry it. And then you just go where to shop and you'll find out. Most bookstores have it. Okay, let's see. I'll stop sharing there now. And
There is a question.
yes.
Is there any move to dedicate Crown land to co-managed trust with First Nation? I know that is definitely the case. Listening to these wonderful stories, it does seem that governance is a hodgepodge. Yes, that's true too.
Okay, so we'll start with the first part. There used to be a program on the islands that was called a free Crown land grant. And some of the islands, the lucky ones, applied for those grants and they were able to get one piece of Crown land or maybe 2 turned into conservation land. And so it created a title because Crown land doesn't have a title. So a title was created and it was transferred to one of these conservation land trusts. That is not going on anymore. That program has stopped because basically the idea is that these crown lands on the islands are going to be managed by First Nations. In what way is yet to be determined. And then your second comment, listen to these wonderful stories. It does seem that governance is hodgepodge. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. But each land trust is a charity, and each land trust is a BC nonprofit run by a volunteer board of directors. So they all share that in common. And in fact, there's something called the Land Trust Standards and Practices. And they were kind of created over many, many years ago. And land trusts try to work through, by those standards and practices, and it's got started in the US and where they actually have certification going on. But a lot of it, of course, demands spending lots more money in order to meet those standards and practices. But the work that these people are doing, these organizations are doing, is incredible, and it's focused, and they're very successful. And in many cases, they do work with, or they get funding from sometimes the federal or provincial governments, and of course, all kinds of foundations, including particularly the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation. Yeah, so.
I just allowed people that they could unmute themselves. So,
Yeah.
for example, David, if you want to just clarify something there, you've got to unmute yourself, though. You can go ahead and do that.
A delicious food mix with no fixed recipe. Nice. Okay, any other questions?
Sheila, maybe I'll just put one to you. It's a little bit different, but I'm just thinking of our youth, our younger people coming up, and knowing how you sort of began to get involved in all these various movements. And I certainly recall some in my youth, but it's a difficult world there. Do you have any advice for younger people and how we can, what things we can do for
Yeah, well,
be involved in the conservation movement?
right. Well, the young people are the ones being hired these days. I mean, I could probably not get a job because I'm too old, but it's the young people that are getting hired. And now, of course, there is training in conservation biology, conservation management. These are fields now that didn't exist 20 years ago. And so a lot of people young people are signing up and getting trained in those fields and getting hired. And there's basically 4 province-wide land trusts in BC, and all 4 of them have a lot of staff. And then there's the new BC Parks Foundation, the newest conservancy on the island, in BC. They have an incredible amount of staff, especially for the fact that they're only 3 years old. But they have an amazing board who has managed to put things in the right places. And so they've been given a lot of funding from the feds and the province, and particularly for Indigenous-led conservation, which is kind of the new thing on the block. Yeah, so, young people. Okay, so sorry, I maybe got sidetracked a minute there. Young people can get involved through, of course, careers, but they can also get involved because there's all kinds of restoration and invasive species management going on everywhere, in Vancouver as well, I'm quite sure. In Vancouver, there's the Nature Trust of BC operates out of Vancouver, as does the BC Parks Foundation. And of course, the BC Parks Foundation has several young people's programs. So there's actually a lot of opportunity for young people today, and a lot more than there was 30 years ago, that's for sure. Yeah, I gotta say, I was totally thrilled when I discovered your Discover magazine. What a great magazine you have there. I think it was a woman on Bowen Island who gave me a couple of copies, and I actually quoted from a couple of them in the book. Fantastic magazine there you've got.
I think there's a few of the people that are involved in that, editing that on listening today.
Yes, and your book will be in there, Sheila. I don't know if you know that yet or not. Will be mentioned in there.
Yeah, good, great, yeah.
It's so interesting. I urge people to have a look at your book. Um, you can just dive into one of the chapters, and everyone, like you said, is so different, and the types of people that were involved. And I was I was quite overcome with how generous and just how hard they worked. But there's a lot of optimism, and I think in this era we're hearing so much negative stuff and fake news that it's quite wonderful to hear some stories about people who just worked hard and had a dream. I think of the whole Killarney Lake area. We went on a field trip there a couple of years ago with Nature Vancouver, and I just think if those people hadn't done that, we probably would have been, we couldn't have done that kind of walk, and it was a very nice walk to do from here, from Vancouver. So it's one
Yeah.
illustration of probably. Do you have a favorite eco niche on the islands yourself?
Oh, no, I love it all. I am aware though that wetlands are definitely the biggest ecosystem that's threatened, and along with all the species associated with wetlands. And so if there's an opportunity to conserve wetlands, including lakes, that's just a priority in this day and age. Yeah.
I really like what Anne Howson said. Thank you for your passion and dedication to Nature Conservancy over the years, Sheila. That was a fascinating presentation. It gives us hope.
Yeah, it's a different time now, but it's still going on. You know, there's all kinds of conservation going on right now. There's two maps at the beginning of the book that show the lands that were protected in 2000 and the lands that are protected in 2022. And so over that 22 years, it's a huge amount of land that has been protected. And so it's kind of nice to see it graphically, to look at that difference. And of course, now 2024, there's even more land protected. And as I'm sure you all know, there's an international goal to protect 30% of land and water by 2030, which is coming right up. And the reason for that, of course, is because in order to, you know, kind of keep the resilience of our ecosystems and all those species that are at risk, we need to protect at least that by 2030 and then more after that.